Why didn't anyone come to see me? Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper as she looked around the quiet hospital room, the sunlight slipping through the half-open blinds and falling on the pale blue sheets, untouched, and the tray of food still cold on the side table. She had been here for 2 days, recovering from a minor procedure, and the absence of her family weighed heavier than the faint beep of the heart monitor beside her bed. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic, mingling with the lingering scent of her lavender shampoo, and she could hear the distant chatter of nurses in the hallway, footsteps tapping rhythmically on the linoleum floor. Margaret pressed her hands to the warm fabric of the blanket across her lap, feeling the texture like an anchor against the rising tide of unease. Just yesterday, her granddaughter Sophie had come to visit, bringing a card and a small bouquet of daisies, but the atmosphere had been stiff, almost too polite, and Margaret had noticed the hesitation in Sophie's smile, the slight furrow in her brow that suggested something unsaid, a secret carefully kept. The memory of that moment now pressed into her chest, each heartbeat a quiet reminder that appearances were deceptive. She remembered the way Sophie had lingered near the doorway, glancing over her shoulder as if weighing whether to speak freely or hold back, the gentle tilt of her head, and the rapid blink of green eyes that had always held a mixture of mischief and earnestness. Margaret had waited patiently, sipping the lukewarm water from the hospital cup, trying to read the subtle signals, but Sophie had said only a few words, talking about school and weekend plans, and then retreated with a quick hug, leaving Margaret with a lingering sense of incompleteness. Now, alone in the sterile room, Margaret replayed the conversation in her mind, noting every nuance, every hesitant pause, every breath that seemed to carry unspoken truths. She shifted slightly in the bed, adjusting the pillow behind her shoulders, and felt a quiet determination rise, not the hot anger of a sudden revelation, but the slow, cold clarity that comes from years of observing human behavior and understanding patterns. Her mind traced back through the past months, to dinners left untouched, invitations ignored, phone calls left unanswered, and holiday gatherings where she had smiled and nodded while feeling the sting of exclusion. Each memory stacked like bricks, solidifying into a structure she could not ignore. Margaret's eyes wandered to the window again, watching the soft swaying of the tree branches outside, the gentle movement contrasting with the rigid stillness of her own surroundings. She thought about the times she had offered help, guidance, her own savings and resources quietly, without expectation of acknowledgement, only to be met with subtle dismissals, polite refusals, or calculated indifference. The warmth she had once associated with family had been replaced by a careful performance, smiles that didn't reach the eyes, compliments that felt like measurements of convenience, and gestures that carried the weight of obligation rather than affection. As she absorbed the silence, the faint hum of the air conditioning filling the room, Margaret's attention snapped to a small sound near the door. Sophie's voice, timid, hesitant, almost guilty, breaking the pattern of silence. Margaret turned her head slightly, her silver hair catching the light, and listened as Sophie stumbled through an explanation, revealing details that she perhaps did not realize were fully audible. Bits and pieces of private conversations, mentions of plans she hadn't been included in, hints at decisions being made without her knowledge, all spilling inadvertently. Margaret's lips pressed together in a thin line, not out of shock or hurt, but as a measure, a silent taking of note. Her mind cataloged each revelation, fitting them into the larger picture she had begun to assemble over months, years even, of subtle neglect and manipulation. The room seemed to hold its breath with her, the sterile walls absorbing the quiet intensity of her focus. Margaret did not flinch, did not cry, did not lash out. Instead, she sat still, letting the moment pass, letting the truths settle around her like snow settling on the branches outside. In that stillness, clarity emerged. She had been underestimated, overlooked, treated as peripheral rather than central, but she had also observed, remembered, and learned. A slow, measured plan began to take shape in her mind, not one of confrontation or harsh words, but one of quiet assertion, of actions that would speak with weight and precision, allowing the family to understand, in their own time, the consequences of ignoring her. Margaret shifted again, this time leaning back, closing her eyes briefly, feeling the warmth of the afternoon sun spill over her face and arms. The moment held a suspended tension, the calm before the storm that would inevitably follow. Her heartbeat slowed, each thump a steady reassurance that she was present, aware, and fully in command of her own responses. In that quiet room, Margaret Collins understood more clearly than she had in years that patience was power, observation was insight, and restraint was strength, and she resolved to move forward not with overt anger, but with the measured steps of someone who had seen the patterns, had felt the exclusion, and would now allow the unfolding of truth to reveal itself in the most compelling, undeniable ways. Margaret sat quietly in the hospital chair by the window, the afternoon light casting long shadows across the pale green walls, the room still humming with the faint mechanical sounds of monitors and ventilators from the neighboring rooms. She held the small bouquet of daisies Sophie had brought yesterday in her lap, petals soft and slightly wilted, and her fingers traced the edges absent-mindedly. Each petal seemed to whisper back memories of times she had invested in her family, dinners she had prepared meticulously, the early morning walks to help her son get ready for school, and the countless holidays she had decorated the house for with precision, only to be sidelined or ignored in small, almost imperceptible ways. She noticed the slight crease in her brow, the subtle tension in her shoulders, but there was no outward expression of frustration, only a careful observation. The nurse brought in a tray with soup and crackers, placing it gently on the table beside her, and Margaret thanked her softly, her voice steady, betraying none of the swirling thoughts in her mind. She thought of Olivia, her daughter-in-law, how she had orchestrated the absence of other family members through polite excuses and careful scheduling, ensuring that Margaret remained in the periphery, kept at a distance from the events of the family, while maintaining a veneer of propriety. Margaret's gaze shifted to the hospital corridor, watching the orderly pace of nurses and visitors, the way their conversations floated faintly through the air, full of casual concern, yet detached from the undercurrents of tension she had begun to perceive. She reflected on Ethan, her son, the way he had been accommodating on the surface but complicit in the small acts of exclusion, nodding along to Olivia's suggestions, deferring to her judgment, allowing the subtle manipulation to continue unchecked. Margaret's lips pressed together as she absorbed the quiet truth of the situation, the details revealed unintentionally by Sophie fitting neatly into a larger pattern she had been aware of but lacked confirmation for until now. She remembered the slight hesitation in Sophie's voice, the almost imperceptible shifts in her posture, and the way her eyes darted briefly to Olivia before settling on Margaret, each movement carrying a fragment of hidden information. Margaret did not feel the sting of betrayal as a hot, immediate pain, but rather as a cool, steady recognition, an understanding of the reality she had long suspected. She adjusted her robe, smoothing the fabric across her knees, and allowed herself a measured exhale, the rhythm of her breathing steady and deliberate, grounding her in the present. Each small detail, the timing of visits, the arrangement of meals, the stories half told and half withheld, layered into a map of deliberate oversight and careful orchestration that Margaret now read with a clarity she had not allowed herself to see before. The sterile smell of the hospital, mingled with the faint scent of the daisies, seemed to settle around her, marking this space as one of observation and reflection rather than vulnerability. Margaret's mind began cataloging her next steps, not with anger but with calculated awareness, noting opportunities to assert herself quietly yet decisively, the weight of past omissions fueling a resolve that demanded recognition without confrontation. She turned slightly to watch Sophie at the foot of the bed, busying herself with a small sketchbook, unaware that every casual motion, every innocent-sounding phrase, had contributed to the revelation Margaret now held fully in her mind. There was no rush, no impulsive reaction, only the slow, deliberate assembly of understanding and strategy. Margaret felt the gravity of her position, not as a victim of neglect, but as a witness to it, a quiet observer with the advantage of insight. In the soft hum of the hospital room, with sunlight angled just so across the windowsill, Margaret Collins allowed herself a moment of stillness, the tension in her chest easing into a controlled anticipation, knowing that the knowledge gained here, quietly, would inform the precise and measured actions she intended to take in the days ahead. The world outside moved along its normal rhythms, unaware of the undercurrents in this small room. Yet Margaret's awareness was acute, each sound, each shadow, each whispered step carrying a new layer of meaning, and she remained seated, composed, her mind active and her heart calm, ready to proceed with careful purpose. Margaret shifted slightly in the hospital chair, the sunlight warming her shoulders, and she allowed herself a moment to study the room with deliberate calm. The small television in the corner flickered quietly, playing a morning news segment that she barely registered, her attention anchored instead on the subtle movements of the people passing in the corridor outside. A nurse wheeled a patient bed past, softly calling the name of the visitor who had arrived, and Margaret noted the ease with which others received attention and concern, a stark contrast to the absence she had experienced. Her hands rested lightly on her lap, the thin hospital blanket draped neatly across her knees, and she allowed herself to recall small, unspoken acts from the past weeks, calls that went unanswered, messages left on voicemail, invitations to dinners and holiday events that were met with polite decline or vague excuses. Each memory stacked quietly in her mind, not provoking rage, but crystallizing understanding. She could see the patterns now, the way Olivia had suggested alternate plans, carefully orchestrated to ensure Margaret remained peripheral, while Ethan offered gentle agreement that seemed innocent on the surface but served to reinforce the isolation. Margaret's gaze drifted to Sophie, still at the end of the bed, sketchbook in hand, sketching abstract lines with small, careful movements. The girl occasionally glanced up, hesitating, as if testing whether she should speak, the hesitation conveying more than words could capture. Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line, not out of anger, but as a measure of control, cataloging the inadvertent revelations Sophie had provided. She considered the weeks prior to this visit, the subtle shifts in conversation, the way her opinions were quietly overridden, the soft redirection of attention away from her presence. Nothing had been loud, nothing had been blatant, but the cumulative effect was clear. Margaret's breathing remained steady, the air of the hospital crisp and clean around her, each inhale a reminder of the calm that came with clarity. She envisioned the upcoming conversations and gatherings, the ways Olivia and Ethan had constructed their social and familial plans without including her, and she allowed herself the quiet satisfaction of foresight, seeing the moves that could be anticipated, the patterns that could now be navigated with precision. Her eyes lingered briefly on the sterile white walls, decorated only with a few pastel prints, and she considered the symbolic distance they represented, the emotional space created by family decisions made without her input. Margaret shifted again, adjusting the pillow behind her back, the movement subtle but deliberate, and felt the solid weight of patience settling over her. Each detail, each small gesture of omission or distraction, became data to be understood, analyzed, and, when the time was right, addressed in her own measured, quiet way. The room held its ordinary sounds, the soft rolling of carts, the faint chatter of visitors in other rooms, the distant hum of machinery, but Margaret filtered these out, letting only the patterns of behavior and the small revelations filter through, shaping her understanding of the subtle manipulation she had endured. There was no rush, no need for immediate action, only observation, reflection, and the careful assembling of strategy in her mind. She imagined the next family gatherings, the moments where insight would allow her to respond not in heat, but in calculated, controlled ways, letting the truths she now fully understood speak for themselves through measured actions. Margaret remained still, her silver hair catching the light from the window, eyes focused yet calm, the room around her a quiet theater in which she silently planned the steps that would follow, each thought deliberate, each observation precise, each movement designed to retain composure while gaining full understanding of the family dynamics she now saw with absolute clarity. Margaret leaned back slightly in the hospital chair, the faint sunlight sliding across the linoleum floor and illuminating the soft folds of her robe. She let her gaze wander to the small side table where the untouched water glass reflected the light in a delicate shimmer. Each sip of water she had taken earlier seemed like a deliberate exercise in patience. each small action carrying more weight than the casual movements of anyone passing by could guess. She reflected on past conversations, the way Olivia had redirected holiday plans to ensure her absence, the polite explanations that masked intention, the subtle reframing of social gatherings so that Margaret remained on the edge rather than at the center of family life. Her eyes caught the small bouquet of daisies Sophie had brought, the petals slightly curling, and she traced their edges absent-mindedly, each curve reminding her of the delicate, often overlooked details that made up her life within this household. She remembered the evenings spent arranging family dinners, coordinating schedules, and ensuring everyone felt welcomed, often sacrificing her own comfort and time, only to find that those efforts had been absorbed as background noise, invisible gestures in the flow of daily life. The room remained quiet, except for the distant footsteps in the corridor and the occasional soft murmur of a nurse checking on another patient, and Margaret felt the weight of reflection settle over her, heavy but controlled, an internal landscape of awareness rather than outward emotion. She considered the interactions she had observed between Olivia and Ethan, the subtle nods, the smiles that did not reach the eyes, the careful structuring of excuses that kept her in the periphery, and she cataloged them in her mind with precision, forming a mental map of patterns and intentions. Her hands rested gently in her lap as she adjusted the blanket across her knees, the movement deliberate and composed, a small act that reinforced her sense of stability in an environment where she had often been rendered peripheral. The sunlight shifted as the afternoon moved toward evening, casting longer shadows across the room, and Margaret allowed herself to reflect on the quiet tension that had been accumulating over months of polite omissions and deliberate redirections, the ways in which her presence had been minimized without ever being challenged. She let her attention shift again to Sophie, absorbed in her small sketchbook, unaware that the careful observations of Margaret were charting the subtleties of behavior and words that had once seemed incidental. Margaret recognized the delicate balance between speaking and withholding, the power in patience and in observation, and she felt a measured satisfaction in knowing that understanding came before action, that insight could be wielded quietly, with precision. The subtle hum of the air conditioning, the faint metallic smell of the hospital room, and the soft rustle of pages turning in Sophie's sketchbook created a backdrop of calm that allowed Margaret to focus inward, her mind cataloging, assessing, and preparing for the careful steps she would take once she returned to her home and daily routines. There was no outward tension, no rush to confrontation, only the silent accumulation of knowledge and awareness, a quiet readiness that she could rely upon. Margaret sat still, breathing evenly, allowing the room and its ordinary rhythms to fade into a backdrop as she considered the careful, deliberate planning that patience allowed. Each small sound, each minor movement in the room, was a cue she registered and stored, each detail a piece of a larger puzzle she had long been piecing together, forming the basis for a measured response when the time was right. In this quiet, controlled state, Margaret Collins embodied the subtle strength of observation, the power of restrained awareness, and the readiness to act with calm precision when circumstances would allow, her mind fully engaged in understanding the currents around her without the need for haste or dramatics. Margaret shifted slightly in the hospital chair, adjusting the blanket over her knees and letting her hands rest lightly on the fabric, feeling the faint texture of the weave against her fingers as she allowed her thoughts to unfold quietly. The soft hum of the air conditioning filled the room, mingling with the distant chatter and occasional footsteps outside, creating a rhythm that seemed to reinforce her focus rather than distract her. She reflected on the subtle cues she had noticed over recent weeks, the way Olivia had suggested alternate times for visits, the polite deflections that left Margaret out of conversations, the small decisions made without her input, all accumulating into a pattern that was now impossible to ignore. Each recollection was accompanied by a quiet, almost imperceptible tightening in her chest, not of anger, but of awareness, a recognition of the orchestration behind these choices. Margaret traced her fingers along the edges of the small daisies Sophie had left, the petals curling slightly at the tips, and she allowed herself to recall every precise action she had taken to maintain harmony, to show care and presence, while often being sidelined. The memory of Ethan's polite compliance, the way he had nodded in agreement with Olivia's suggestions, surfaced alongside the recollection of dinners and family events she had carefully prepared, ensuring warmth and welcome for everyone else, yet consistently finding herself pushed to the margins. Margaret's eyes followed Sophie as the girl adjusted her sketchbook, the pencil moving with deliberate care, unaware of the weight of the observations Margaret had collected. She considered the information Sophie had inadvertently revealed, each detail fitting into the broader understanding of the family dynamics, confirming what Margaret had sensed for some time but had lacked proof of until now. The sunlight across the hospital window shifted gradually, casting gentle shadows that moved slowly across the floor, accentuating the stillness of the room, and Margaret drew a measured breath, feeling the calm precision of awareness settle over her. She catalogued each act of omission, each diverted attention, each carefully crafted excuse, noting them without judgment, simply as data to guide her measured responses. The quiet environment allowed her to consider possible interactions and gatherings to come, the precise moments where she could act with controlled influence rather than reactive emotion. Margaret remained poised, the weight of understanding steady and clear, recognizing that patience and observation were tools as valuable as any words or gestures. The air in the room seemed to hold a stillness that mirrored her own, each sound. A faint laugh from another room, a rolling cart in the corridor, the murmur of distant voices, integrating into her perception without distraction, reinforcing her strategic awareness. She considered the subtle manipulations that had been layered over time, the quiet redirections and omissions, and the ways in which these patterns could now be anticipated, understood, and approached with deliberate care. Margaret Collins allowed herself the clarity that comes with measured reflection, observing, remembering, and preparing for the precise moments where insight could be translated into calm, controlled action, the quiet authority of her presence carrying weight even in her silence, and she remained seated, composed, and fully aware, allowing the room, the light, and the gentle rhythms of the hospital to frame her thoughts as she mentally planned the careful steps ahead. Margaret shifted her weight in the hospital chair, letting her hands rest lightly on the blanket, feeling the subtle warmth of the afternoon sun that had moved lower across the window pane. She traced the edge of the small notebook Sophie had left at the foot of the bed, noting the delicate sketches and the quiet care with which they were drawn, each line seemingly innocent, yet revealing more than the girl realized. Margaret reflected on the moments leading up to this hospital stay, the dinners prepared, the errands run, and the countless small gestures of thoughtfulness that had been taken for granted or overlooked, and she cataloged each memory with careful precision. Her mind wandered through the recent family interactions, noticing the subtle exchanges between Olivia and Ethan, the ways in which decisions were framed to exclude her input, the polite deferrals that masked intention, all of which had now crystallized into a clear pattern she could analyze. She observed the stillness of the room, the muted colors of the walls, the soft hum of distant equipment, and allowed herself to think strategically, not emotionally, about the interactions yet to come, weighing each choice, anticipating responses, and considering the most effective ways to assert her presence without confrontation. Margaret's eyes shifted to the window, following the slow sway of the trees outside, the movement gentle and rhythmic, a counterpoint to the precise calculations forming in her mind about how she would navigate the family dynamics she had come to understand so clearly. Each detail, from the faint creak of the floor outside to the pattern of shadows across the room, was absorbed as part of the landscape she now surveyed with intent focus, noting opportunities for subtle influence and quiet assertion. She allowed herself to reflect on Sophie again, noting the girl's attentiveness, the careful way she handled the notebook, and the inadvertent glimpses of truth that had surfaced through her actions. Margaret cataloged these as part of her understanding, not with resentment, but with awareness, recognizing that insight and timing were her strongest tools. She considered the upcoming family gatherings, the routines of meals, visits, and casual conversations, and imagined how she could move through them with measured poise, allowing observation and subtle action to reveal the truths that had been obscured. The gentle breeze from the slightly open window brushed her face, and she adjusted her posture, feeling the calm and control that came from patience and foresight, the knowledge that action did not have to be immediate to be effective. Margaret's breathing remained steady, her focus on the collection of details and the patterns of behavior around her, each moment adding to her growing clarity and understanding. She allowed herself a quiet confidence, knowing that the knowledge gained in this still room, in these unspoken observations, would guide her measured and deliberate steps once she returned to her routines, ensuring that the truth she now comprehended would be acknowledged in the appropriate way. Each soft sound, each fleeting shadow, each small gesture by Sophie became part of the broader picture Margaret now held, and she remained still, composed, and fully aware, allowing the calm observation to guide her next moves with precision and quiet authority. Margaret shifted slightly in the hospital chair, the afternoon light spilling across the floor in soft, elongated patterns, and she let her hands rest gently on her lap, observing the subtle movements of the hospital room around her. She noted the faint hum of equipment, the distant voices carrying through the corridor, the occasional footsteps of visitors and staff passing by, and she allowed herself to catalog each sound and motion without judgment, each detail layering onto the understanding she had been building. Margaret's attention returned to the small notebook Sophie had left beside the bed, the sketches delicate and precise, a quiet reflection of the girl's inner thoughts, and she considered how small actions could reveal far more than intended. The memory of Sophie's hesitant words, the slight pause before speaking, and the careful avoidance of eye contact with Olivia, all formed a mosaic of inadvertent truth that Margaret now analyzed meticulously. She reflected on the weeks and months leading up to this moment, the dinners, carefully prepared, the family events coordinated to create warmth, the numerous phone calls, the gentle reminders, and the small gestures that had been consistently overlooked or quietly redirected, leaving her on the periphery. Each recollection strengthened her awareness, a cool clarity rather than a rush of emotion, as she connected patterns and intentions, seeing the subtle orchestration that had kept her distanced from the center of family life. Margaret considered Olivia's soft suggestions, Ethan's polite acquiescence, and the way their coordination had ensured that she remained unaware of certain arrangements and plans. She noted the layers of omission and distraction, each one small in isolation but powerful in accumulation, and she allowed herself a quiet satisfaction in recognizing the full picture. Margaret's gaze shifted to the window once more, the branches of the trees moving gently with the breeze, a natural rhythm contrasting with the deliberate calculations forming in her mind about how she would navigate future family interactions. She imagined upcoming conversations, casual encounters at meals, the ordinary moments that carried hidden significance, and she measured in her mind the steps she could take to maintain composure while subtly asserting her awareness. The sunlight changed slowly, casting long, soft shadows across the room, and Margaret felt the weight of patience settle over her, the calm focus reinforcing the sense of quiet control she had cultivated. Each sound, each movement, each whispered phrase in the room became part of her analysis, forming a comprehensive understanding of the family dynamics she now observed with precision. Margaret's breathing remained steady, her posture relaxed yet alert, allowing insight to shape the way she would move forward. She did not need to speak or act immediately, for observation and understanding had become her most powerful tools, and she held them with deliberate care. The room's quiet rhythm, the light, and the subtle interactions around her framed her thoughts, allowing Margaret Collins to maintain a composed awareness, a readiness to respond thoughtfully and deliberately, knowing that careful observation and patient planning would reveal the truths she now fully understood in the most effective and undeniable way. Margaret adjusted the hospital blanket across her knees and let her hands rest lightly in her lap, observing the quiet rhythm of the room with steady focus. The afternoon light shifted slowly through the blinds, casting long, soft lines across the floor, and she allowed herself to notice every subtle movement. The slow sway of the trees outside, the faint hum of air conditioning, the muted footsteps of staff passing in the corridor. She thought of Sophie, still at the end of the bed, quietly sketching, her pencil moving in careful, deliberate lines, and Margaret considered how even small, unguarded gestures could reveal more than intended. She reflected on the recent family dynamics, the way Olivia and Ethan had subtly redirected plans to exclude her, the quiet omissions and polite deferrals that created distance while preserving appearances. Each recollection strengthened Margaret's understanding, forming a clear picture of intentions previously obscured, and she cataloged these details silently, weighing their significance with the measured patience she had cultivated over the years. The bouquet of daisies Sophie had brought, now slightly curling at the edges, rested on the side table, and Margaret traced the outlines of the petals absent-mindedly, each delicate curve echoing the careful subtleties of family interactions she had long observed. She considered upcoming visits, the casual conversations over meals, and the small, seemingly inconsequential choices that now appeared deliberate, each mapped in her mind as part of a broader understanding. Margaret's gaze returned to the corridor, noting the casual conversations, the gestures of visitors, and the quiet efficiency of the staff, all forming a backdrop against which she could measure and anticipate behavior. She reflected on the times she had extended herself for the family, organizing gatherings, preparing meals, and offering guidance, often without recognition, and contrasted these efforts with the quiet exclusions she had recently observed. Each small observation, from the tilt of a head to the pause before a word was spoken, added to the comprehensive understanding Margaret now held. Her breathing remained steady, her posture composed, and she felt the subtle assurance that came from insight and awareness. The room, the light, the faint sounds all framed her reflections, each element integrated into a clear mental map of family dynamics. Margaret allowed herself a quiet confidence, knowing that observation and patience would provide the most effective foundation for action when the right moments arose. She did not need to react immediately. The knowledge she had gathered was enough to inform her measured steps, ensuring that her presence would be acknowledged thoughtfully and strategically. Margaret Collins remained poised, fully present, her mind alert and engaged, using the stillness around her to solidify understanding, to plan with precision, and to prepare for the careful, deliberate way she would navigate the interactions ahead, allowing the truths she had observed to reveal themselves in their own time through quiet, composed authority. Margaret shifted her gaze to the soft glow of the setting sun filtering through the blinds, the light stretching across the hospital floor in long, amber lines that marked the slow passage of time. She rested her hands lightly in her lap, letting them absorb the calm steadiness she had cultivated, each breath measured and deliberate, each thought weaving together the subtle truths she had gathered. The room was quiet except for the distant hum of machinery and the occasional footsteps of nurses, a rhythm that allowed her to observe without distraction, each sound integrating into the fabric of her awareness. She considered the ways Olivia and Ethan had structured their interactions, the subtle exclusions, the polite diversions, and the careful planning that had kept her unaware of certain decisions, each now clearly revealed through Sophie's inadvertent disclosures. Margaret traced her attention across the room, noting the small bouquet of daisies on the side table, the curling edges of petals a quiet testament to the passage of time and the fragility of moments often overlooked. She reflected on past gatherings, dinners meticulously arranged, holidays celebrated with effort and care, and the countless unrecognized gestures she had made for the family, all of which contrasted sharply with the exclusion she had recently experienced. Margaret cataloged the details of recent visits, phone calls unanswered, invitations declined with polite excuses, and each instance built into a clear, deliberate understanding of the family dynamics at play. Her eyes returned to Sophie, whose small movements and careful handling of the sketchbook had inadvertently revealed the truths Margaret now held fully in mind. The sunlight shifted slowly, the shadows elongating, and Margaret allowed herself a measured exhale, feeling the clarity of awareness settle over her as a calm, deliberate power. She considered upcoming conversations, routine visits, and ordinary moments where insight could translate into quiet authority, letting observation and patient anticipation guide her responses rather than impulsive reaction. Each small sound, movement, and expression became part of a larger map she had constructed, allowing Margaret to navigate the environment with precision and calm. The room's ordinary sounds, the faint murmur of distant voices, the gentle rolling of carts in the corridor, the soft clinking of utensils, formed a backdrop that reinforced her understanding of subtle cues and unspoken intentions. Margaret felt a quiet satisfaction in the knowledge that insight, patience, and observation would be her most effective tools, allowing her to act with controlled decisiveness when the appropriate moment arrived. She shifted slightly, adjusting the blanket across her knees, the movement a quiet demonstration of composure and readiness, and she allowed herself to absorb the room fully, integrating the light, the sound, and the subtle gestures into her awareness. In this stillness, Margaret Collins held complete understanding of the landscape before her. The intricate web of family interactions laid bare through patience and attention, and she prepared quietly for the measured steps she would take, confident that the truth she now understood would unfold with undeniable clarity. Communicated through her calm presence and precise actions, each move deliberate, each observation fully accounted for, allowing the family to recognize the patterns she had long discerned without the need for confrontation or overt declaration.